Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning to some of you. I see that we have a very wide-ranging group of folks joining us from many different locations, or even international. I see that we have some folks from Canada. Welcome to today's webinar, Conducting Implementation Informed Evaluation, Practical Applications and Lessons from Implementation Science. I am Teresa Duncan. I'm the Director of REL Mid-Atlantic. I'm joined today, I have the pleasure of being joined today by my co-host, Rolf Blank, who is a Senior Fellow at NORT, the National Opinion Research Center. He represents Division H. And our presenter, Caryn Ward, who is a Senior Implementation Specialist Scientist at the National Implementation Research Network at the University of North Carolina. I just want to do a quick intro about today's agenda and let you know how we've structured the presentation. Before we start, I want to say a few words about the REL program and how this is a collaboration between REL Mid-Atlantic and Division H. Ralph will say a few words about Division H, and we'll turn it over to Caryn, who will share her extensive knowledge about implementation science with you, give you a quick overview. We'll have a Q&A session. We have it set up for the end of the webinar. We're together for 90 minutes today. The presentation should be about an hour, and so we're hoping to leave about 20-25 minutes at the end for questions and answers. But please do feel free to ask your questions in the question box. And are you able to hear me now? I saw that folks are having trouble hearing me. Well, I'll put the microphone closer to my mouth. So we should have enough time for questions and answers afterwards, but if you do have questions at the beginning or throughout the presentation, please do ask them in the question box, type it in, and then as needed, I'll gently interrupt Caryn and ask her the question. And so, why are we doing this webinar? Well, as you all know, meaningful organizational change is anything but easy. And we know that evidence-based practices, using those, implementing those is important, but as we are aware, these practices are only effective when fully implemented. And so there are a lot of important lessons that implementation science has to share, and so we're taking this as an opportunity to share that information with you and open a dialogue. And so, before we begin, just a few words about the Regional Educational Laboratory Program. I know that some of you are fully aware of the RELs and have probably heard this spiel before, but just a minute of your time, please, so we can introduce ourselves to those who are not familiar with us. The REL program is a federally funded set of centers. There are 10 of us in the United States, and we specialize in different regions. REL Mid-Atlantic works with DC, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, as you can see here. The REL program is 50 years old this year, and so we've been around quite a while. We work usually with SEAs, state education agencies. We also work with local agencies, education agencies, and some schools, but typically at the LEA or SEA level. Within our current 5-year cycle, we work within research alliances to conduct rigorous research, to provide technical assistance, and disseminate the work that we do across networks. So this webinar is an example of our work and is a collaboration with Division H of the American Educational Research Association. These are some examples of the work that we do. And not included in this graphic is part of our mission is to work with other research organizations just like Division H to disseminate, to conduct our work, and to reach out as widely as possible. So let me turn this over to Rolf Blank, and he'll say a few words about Division H. Rolf?
Thanks, Teresa. It's good to be here this afternoon, and we welcome everyone across the country that is able to join us. We kind of strategically planned this webinar for August. Some of you ending vacations and getting back to work, and some of you already working on your efforts for this school year. Division H is the primarily staff that are in schools, districts, universities, agencies, and any institutions across the country that are members of AERA, and they are involved in research and evaluation work. Many of them are interested in expanding their knowledge of the field and what's particularly relevant to their work as they work with schools and district educators. So last year, 2014, our Vice President, Zolly Stevenson, created a professional development committee that of AERA in Division H that could look into the question of what kinds of professional development can we provide to our members and to others that are in addition to participation in the regular annual conference. And so we've been actively involved over the last year in webinars, organizing webinars, and also professional development workshops. And our first webinar in January of this year, some of you may have attended, focused on strategies that districts and schools could use to approach the release of assessments linked to the Common Core, and particularly strategies for preparing educators in the community to be ready for that release. And that webinar recording is still available through the REL Mid-Atlantic. This year, we decided to expand our horizon a little bit, and through input from our committee, we learned that one of the areas that they're particularly interested in being able to work with is implementation science. Most of our folks have a background in data and the use of assessments and collecting data and reporting and doing evaluation studies. But the whole field of implementation and how to assess implementation and improve upon it is something that is a little bit new to many of our members. And so we decided to move into this field, which we saw has been growing, and we reached out for expertise in this area, and we're really happy to have Caryn Ward join us to lead this webinar today, and we hope that you will learn from it, and you will pose some questions for us about how this relates to your work and to your own background in research and evaluation in schools. So I'm going to turn it back to Teresa now, and we'll move on.
Thanks, Ralph. And so I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Caryn Ward from the University of North Carolina and more specifically the National Implementation Research Network, where she is a senior implementation scientist. She works with SEAs and LEAs across the country and to help them implement their various initiatives and to share best practices. She has particular expertise on RTI, and we are very pleased to have her here today. So without further ado, let me welcome Caryn Ward. Caryn, it's all yours.
Thanks, Teresa. Thank you for the welcome, and thank you, Ralph. And I thank the Mid-Atlantic and the AERA Division H for having this webinar today and giving me the opportunity to share the work and learnings of implementation science on the behalf of my colleagues here at NERN, as well as one of our core projects here at NERN, the SysUp Center. Just to give a little bit of shout out to my colleagues, our SysUp is one of our grants that we have here at NERN. It stands for the State Implementation and Scaling Up of Evidence-Based Practices. As my mother says, it's a mouthful. We didn't get to name ourselves. I'm just one of several on the team within NERN that is working hard to assist states and regions and districts build their capacity to use implementation science to support the effective scaling of evidence-based practices. So just a nod to my fellow colleagues there. I believe Caryn Blase, I saw her name pop out, is on the phone listening, so hopefully I do her proud today. I'm sure she'll have lots of good feedback for me at the end. The work I'm going to present today is really the life work of Caryn and Dean as the co-founders of NERN based on their years of research and experience with implementation that I've had the pleasure to join the team along with and continue to develop the field as we move it along. So my goal is to share a little bit of our learnings today as we move forward in our time together. I wanted to share this resource right up front. Teresa and Rolf had sent me questions ahead of time that different folks submitted, and so I had an opportunity to go through those questions. I am going to try and address them throughout the PowerPoint today, throughout our time together, but I did want to share this resource with you up front. A lot of the materials, the learnings, the examples and illustrations that I'm going to use today can also be found on this open source, our Active Implementation Hub, which is an online learning platform for implementation science. It was developed through our SysUp work with education as the primary recipients, but we also see it being used in many, many different fields of where do I get started with implementation science, what does that mean, and where I can learn more. I'll reference this again at the end, but did want to get that resource out to you all right away. All right, so our time together. I only have an hour with you, and I wish we had more because there is so much to share and so much to learn from each other in this work. But our goal for today is to go ahead and provide you with a high-level overview of implementation science and the active implementation framework. And we're going to go a little bit deeper on two of the frameworks, and that is going to be the implementation drivers, specifically looking at the decision to support data system driver, as well as then the use of improvement cycles, specifically looking at usability testing. You're probably wondering, why did I pick those two out of the 5 frameworks that I am going to provide a high-level overview? And my rationale as to why I did that was because I find these give us a good starting point for identifying which data we should be collecting to inform our evaluation work, as well as to inform improvements in our implementation support so that we have sustained and effective use of our practices that we are wanting to have and have our outcomes. So my goal is also to get us thinking and warmed up and try to make this a little bit more interactive for those of you. Some of you may be enjoying this webinar as you sit on the beach and enjoy the last few days of summer before school begins. So wherever you're at, if you would just take a minute and kind of get us ready and thinking about implementation, is answer this question. What is challenging, or what do you find challenging about implementation and evaluation of education initiatives? This is just a free write. I want you to stop and think and type some answers in there. I'm seeing some themes come up as we go through this, which is great. Time, fidelity, access to data, changing contacts, very real, time, engaging and increasing buy-in. I'm going to give just a few more seconds to let folks respond if they haven't had an opportunity to. Being thoughtful. Controlled setting versus classroom application. Money. Yep. You guys are hitting on some big ones. Great. All right. I'm going to go ahead and move us on. Thank you for your participation and playing with me. And that throughout our time together, there's going to be different times where we're going to have different questions like that pop up, as well as Teresa's going to use the question box to get some folks thinking as well. I would like, hopefully by the end of today, if you walk away with anything from our time spent, is thinking about one or two strategies or actions or a question that I made you think about a little bit more deeper that will impact your work tomorrow, or something that you will do differently next week, or that you will raise in a conversation or ask another colleague. That is my goal, and to also give you some things to think about to address some of those different challenges that you were all raising. I find that what you all were coming up with is very real and prevalent. When I did this exercise myself, and you can fill in the blanks there, things that I've experienced when I worked at the district and at the school level, as well as continuing in my new role here at NERN, is that implementation of fill in that blank, say MTSS or RTI, is often a change that challenges old practices. Some control and power ends up being taken away from people. It's not an overnight thing. If I would love to find the magic wand and say we're fully implementing starting tomorrow, would be fantastic. It takes time. It's a multi-year process. We don't always have the expertise and the resources needed. We often sometimes think we do, and when we get into it, we find, yep, we don't have all the expertise that we need it. It's change. I find change is our one constant in education and life in general. And often this means more accountability for the adults in the system, which is a good thing. I've learned from Caryn Blase and my colleagues here that accountability should roll up. It should shift to the system. And implementation is not a linear step-by-step process as much as my linear brain would like it to be. And finally, we know that one size does not fit all. We also have to consider local adaptation while maintaining fidelity to the essential components or those active ingredients of the practice. So all very real challenges. So why implementation? Teresa gave you some rationales in the beginning. I'm going to go a little bit deeper and give in some rationales as why you should have taken some time today in the midst of school starting and the school year kicking off to why is it worth talking about implementation science, the rationale behind it, kind of review a big picture context, and then we'll get into it. So we know that over the past several decades, considerable policy, funding, and research has gone in and focused on the identification of evidence-based practices. We have seen over the years resources pop up of such as What Works Clearinghouse and others of the list of evidence-based, research-based, evidence-informed practices. However, those practices only work, have the intended outcomes, are effective when they're fully implemented. So the level of effort that we've seen applied to identifying what those practices are, we have yet seen to be placed on how they're implemented. And the gap between the identification of those evidence-based programs that we see in the research to then the actual implementation of those is critical. And implementation is what bridges that gap. And we know that we define implementation as a specified set of activities designed to put into practice an activity or program of known dimensions, meaning that we have to be clearly defined of what we're trying to implement. Why focus on implementation? As my good colleague and mentor Dean says, we know that students cannot benefit from innovations or interventions that they do not experience. So Dean and Caryn and the colleagues here at NERN, based on a meta-analysis synthesis of the implementation research literature, drawing from many different fields, manufacturing, public health, child welfare, education, so on, as well as their own research, have identified a formula for success. It's a very simple formula. I love it, to guide us in how do we reach those outcomes and bridge that gap from what we know works in research to the everyday reality of a classroom setting, for example. So our formula is simply a multiplication formula. You've got to start with the what, so we have to have effective innovations that have to be clearly defined with implementation, effective implementation methods, so who and how and when is what activities are needed, and where are those activities and the implementation activities and that effective innovation going to take place. It's got to be within an enabling context or a hospitable environment that's going to support in order to have the outcomes, the educationally significant outcomes or socially significant outcomes that we are shooting for in terms of our impact. When we have, it's a multiplication formula, so if any of those variables are low or null or zero, we see what happens. For example, we don't have the outcomes that we're looking for, and as to repeat Dean once again, students can't benefit from what they don't receive. So I want to set the context a little bit more, give you a little bit more rationales on each of these variables and why they're important to look at, and then we'll talk about, so what does work? What are those active implementation frameworks? One, if we look at effective innovations, for example, this is based on a publication by the U.S. Department of Ed that came out in 2011. When we look at the investments that's been done in evidence-based innovations, they surveyed over 5,000 schools. On average, there was 9 innovations per school, so this data was collected some time ago. I wonder what that would look like now. But on those 9, on average, only 7.8% of them had any evidence to support their effectiveness, which is a precious drain on resources. So despite much of our efforts on identifying what works, we're still seeing low utilization of those evidence-based practices. If we think about what are effective implementation methods, what do we see most commonly? If we look at some of the longitudinal studies on comprehensive school reforms, the goal is that every teacher is trained and continually supported on their use of evidence-based practices. When we follow them up in terms of assessing their actual supports 1 to 3 years later, we find that fewer than 50% of the teachers receive some training. Fewer than 25% of that 50% receive support, and when we look out at outcomes 4 to 5 years later, fewer than 10% use the comprehensive school reform as intended, and overall we see that the vast majority of students do not benefit. And that did a nice summary of why decisions fail when we look at implementation, and a summary of this shows that those methods alone do not result in the use of practices or innovations as intended or with fidelity. When I think back to my time within the districts and schools, we did a large majority of this. We did diffusion or dissemination of information. We love to bring staff in for one-day trainings or a couple-day trainings, pass different policy regulations, provided funding, and hopefully some of us have experienced, maybe not hopefully, but organization change or reorganization to get at implementation. These are all necessary, but we find that they're not sufficient because they only result in a 15% return on investment.
Caryn,
So,
there's a question in the box about how do you define innovation? Do you want to say just a few words about, is it very broad or is it more narrowly defined?
Sure, that's a great question. So I'm using that term innovation to include practices or programs or interventions. Why I use innovation, it is more broadly, I find when in education, when we say intervention, most folks go right to a tier 2 or a tier 3, something in addition that's being provided to students other than their high-quality core instruction. Innovation could be a high-quality core instructional program in literacy, for example. It could also be a new data assessment system that's being rolled out as well, if that gives some guidance on my language. Great, thanks, Dale. Good question and good catch. Give me feedback as we go through here. All right, so let's finally look at rationale, kind of our context. So we work in very complex environments in the systems that we work within that are ever changing, that evidence-based practices or evidence-informed innovations have to work with their way through in order to have improved outcomes for all students. Just take a look at one of those blue balls on the screen there and try and follow it through to see what happens. Use the slide with superintendents and other leaders within SEAs and school districts as well as regional agencies, and this seems to resonate very well with folks in that they feel this at times. So I hope you're getting that same sense, but my goal here was to say that we're not in a clean laboratory environment in the real world. The environments that we work in are very complex. They're ever-changing and constant, and it's humans interacting with one another, which leads, that can impact implementation as well. All right, so now that I set some rationales and provided some background context, what does work? And this is, again, based on our formula for success, based on that meta-analysis synthesis of the research literature as to what we have developed 5 frameworks to address each of these variables in terms of the what, the who, the how, and the when, and the where. So let's take a look at those 5 frameworks. First and foremost, for the what, we have the framework of effective and usable interventions or innovations. And this is where we have a couple criteria 4 criteria to guide what we define as a usable innovation. One is you have to clearly know the program's philosophy and background to it. The critical components or those active ingredients that are essential to receiving the outcomes need to be identified and known. They also have to be defined or operationalized. What is exactly people, practitioners, teachers, adults that they're saying and doing that we can readily see if the practice is happening. And then finally, we have to have a fidelity assessment. So in the end, that our usable innovation is teachable, learnable, doable, and can be readily assessed in practice. Our second framework is the implementation stages. We know that implementation doesn't happen overnight, as much as we all like it would too at times, and that there are key critical steps that need to happen to lead to that successful implementation. NERN has identified in our work 4 implementation stages of exploration, installation, initial implementation, and full implementation. Within each of those stages are those key steps or activities that need to be engaged in. Those stages are not linear. They are recursive and overlapping and additive, as much as my linear brain would like them to be. And we often find that many of us skip the exploration and somewhat of the installation work, and we don't realize it until we're in initial implementation and we're having to back up. And that's okay. We back up, and they are going to have to get done at some time. Our third framework is the implementation drivers. Those are the critical supports or the key activities that are needed to make the change and form the infrastructure. This is the one of the frameworks that we're going to go a little bit deeper on. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And our fourth one is implementation teams. Somebody has to be responsible for driving and held accountable for guiding the change process and ensuring it. And then finally, our fifth framework is improvement cycles. And that is how we use improvement cycles to address the enabling context or to create that hospital environment so that we can solve problems or barriers or threats to effective use of the practice, and helps us get started and get better as we move along. So the 2 that we're going to go a little bit deeper on today, since we only have a little bit of time together, is the drivers as well as the improvement cycles. All right, well, let's dive into those drivers. So here is our graphic of the drivers. We talk about 3 categories of implementation drivers in order to lead to effective instructional practices and the system change that is needed to support them to then reach overall improved student outcomes. Our 3 sets are the competency drivers, which are the mechanisms that help to develop, improve, and sustain one's ability to use an intervention in order to benefit. And we're going to talk about each of those: selection, training, coaching, and performance assessment a little bit further. We have our organizational drivers, which are the mechanisms to create and sustain those hospital organizational and systems environments. So what data are we using to drive our decision making, and what does our barrier busting look like to threats and there are issues or problems that arise internal to the system as well as those external to the system. And finally, our set of leadership drivers about how we manage the technical and adaptive strategies that we face in our implementation work. A key point to these three sets of drivers is that they're integrated and compensatory. I can't talk about one driver and not find myself referencing or talking about another driver. They are very much interrelated together, and they're compensatory in nature, meaning that if one is weak, then others will pick up and support that weakness and compensate for it. So for example, if our selection practices are weak in our hiring and recruiting of staff, then we need to compensate that with how we're training and coaching moving forward. So they're compensatory in nature as well. So let's look at each of these a little bit more in depth. We'll start with leadership. There's lots of literature out there on effective leadership. NERN tends to, we look at a broad majority of it, but we tend to speak most heavily within using Heifetz and Laurie's work, where they identify different challenges, technical and adaptive challenges that call for different leadership strategies. So technical leadership is leadership for those problems that are clearly defined, agreed upon, the solutions are readily available and known. Technical strategies includes things like effective team meeting processes as one example. Adaptive strategies, on the other hand, are for those adaptive problems that are not clearly defined. The problem is not clearly identified. There may be competing perspectives on what the problem is, and the solution is not readily known or available, and there could also be differing views on what that solution is. So Heifetz and Laurie stress the importance of matching the type of leadership strategy to the type of the challenge that's being encountered, or unintentionally we can acerbate the problem. Adaptive strategies includes those such as getting on the balcony, doing the big picture historical view, looking at trends, that's the metaphorical balcony, to protecting the voices of people, so allowing staff to raise concerns. Another one, for example, is giving the work back to the people, so engaging those that are most close to the work and the practice for consensus building and having a say in it moving forward. So those are the leadership drivers are at the base of the triangle. We find an ebb and a flow in implementation work between going back and forth between technical and adaptive leadership work that is needed in order to support effective use of practices. Next, I want to talk about the competency drivers. Love the competency drivers. This is using implementation-informed practices and how we select and recruit staff, whether that's new staff or existing staff. How do we employ effective training, as well as then provide a coaching system to support and build in routine use of fidelity assessments. So some examples of an implementation-informed selection practice would include things like giving teachers scenarios, say give them data to consider when in the hiring process and seeing how they interpret that data. What questions do they ask? How do they use it to guide a lesson plan? So you're giving them behavioral scenarios and asking them to engage and display the skill, hiring a new superintendent or assistant superintendent, having them watch an instructional lesson and asking them to give how would they provide feedback on that lesson, what were the core elements they saw. Or I had one principal that I was working with that in hiring the assistant principal went on walkthroughs within the building, the potential candidates, and then a debrief was done to see what did she see, what did she not see, and how would she give that feedback. That gives us an opportunity to assess not only skill, but also assess how receptive that person is to feedback, because we want to be able to select for the unteachable traits, characteristics, as well, that we know are difficult to tackle with training and coaching. So that's some examples of an implementation-informed selection practices, and there's some good data that can come out of that. Training, implementation-informed training practices. This is, training is not a one-time shot. although my former district loved to do that, used to drive me nuts. But training should be providing not only the theory and the content, demonstrate the skills, but also provide youth practitioners the opportunities to practice and apply the skill themselves in training and receive feedback on that application. Also, implementation form training practices, use pre-post assessments of knowledge or skills that is being attained during training where folks are given the opportunity to apply, they're receiving feedback during that time, and training effectiveness is being evaluated on how well we're reaching our objectives. Our coaching driver is all about feedback. We know that from John Hattie's visible learning work, for example, that feedback is needed for our students in their learning. Well, feedback is also needed for the adults as well when they're learning new skills and putting new practices into place. For example, Joyce and Showers found in their 2002 research article, as well as Dumpton and their metasynthesis that just came out this past July, that coaching or that opportunity to provide feedback on the use of the application within the classroom is imperative to getting use in the classroom. With just training alone, with the opportunity of providing application and training and getting feedback, we see 5% use in the classroom. When we add in that coaching element, we see upwards of 95% use in the classroom. Finally, we need performance assessments or fidelity assessments to help measure the strength and presence of an innovation and whether it's being implemented as it's intended. That fidelity data should then be used to inform how well are those competency drivers or those implementation supports are in place working. So how well is our training? How well is the coaching working? How can those supports be improved upon or tweaked based on the fidelity data that's coming in? And that should be routine. It should be built in. And we're going to go a little bit deeper on that as well, but I wanted to provide that high-level overview of the competency training. All righty. So let's look at, before I jumped, I did want to reference that you can't evaluate a ghost system. The system supporting the use of this practice has to be a host system, one that's transparent, visible, and easily captured. So some competency tools, driver tools that SysUp and NERN has developed that you can find on that website, for example, is a training plan template, developing a coaching system worksheet, as well as a coaching service delivery plan template that specifies what are our coaching practices, when do we use them, how do we assess the effectiveness of coaching, and how do we titrate coaching based on when we see good fidelity and good outcomes. So I'm just getting a question about clarifying the ghost system. So I threw in one of our language there. A ghost system is a system that is running behind the scenes that if you live in the system long enough, you know how to work it. So for example, in my former district, I had a building principal that was really savvy that would call down the district central office hallway, and she would call down that hallway different offices until she got the answer that she wanted. She knew how to work that ghost system to get the information that she was looking for. As one example, a host system, the opposite of a ghost system, is one that is very transparent, it's visible, it's easily seen and recognized. A new person coming into the system can clearly see how does the implementation supports for that practice or running of the system work. All right. So let's talk about those organizational drivers. On the right-hand side of that triangle there, decision support data system, facilitative administration, and systems intervention. Organizational drivers help us ensure that we're changing the system to support effective and sustained use of the practice, rather than the practice being adapted to fit the current system, the latter of which I think we see too often. So this is about how do we use data from the decision support system to continually improve the supports and the practices that is being implemented and used, to then the facilitative administration and systems intervention drivers are about how do we engage in that barrier busting or problem solving when there are issues or um, difficulties raised internal to the system, as well as those threats that are coming from outside the system. And so it's about supporting and making the new ways of work easier for folks rather than more difficult. So this is really ensuring that we're having that organizational system built, as well as that enabling context for folks. So where I would like to go a little bit more deeper is on that decision support data system. So why do we need a decision support data system? The decision support data systems help us identify what data should be collected. So we're not only answering, did we have our intended impact on outcomes, the first and foremost in many of our evaluation work, but also data to drive how well did we do it, and how well can we improve and inform the implementation support that are being provided to support the use of that practice and sustain it over time. A well-designed decision support data system allows districts and school systems to make timely informed decisions and engage in that continuous improvement. So you're going to see it's going to rely heavily on improvement cycles. Developing that comprehensive data system supports sustainability by continuous attention to those key implementation practices. Let's face it, what gets measured, it gets changed and sustained, is given that message of importance. And it helps facilitate active engagement as well as shared engagement by different stakeholders within the system as well as outside the system. And it just basically lets us know how are we doing and supports that confidence building and making the necessary organizational changes to support the use of the practice. And I'm glad some folks are relating to my cartoon character there of all that data collection, because we want to collect good data, but then we also have to use it. All right, so let's go a little bit further. So what are some best practices of a decision support data system? One, which data should we be collecting? We should be collecting outcome data, not only short-term as well as long-term, to look at the impact our practices are having for our students as well as our staff there. We want to assess the fidelity or the strength and the presence of the innovation. NERN talks about fidelity within 3 different components of fidelity. We look at the content, which is the program or the practice, the content being adhered to, for one example, the context of the innovation or the practice. So for example, if the practice is recommending a literacy program be implemented with small groups of 3 to 4 students, is that happening, or are we seeing groups of 8 to 10 students, or even whole class at times I've seen? Or, for example, what is the teacher requisite training for that program? Get that context. And then finally, competence. This is the most critical aspect of fidelity that I think is often our hardest to get at in assessing, is how well is that practice being used, the quality to which it is. So we want to assess outcomes as well as fidelity. And then we have process or effort data. So for examples of that would be number of teachers trained, our reach data, how many schools at what stage of implementation, event evaluation data, our selection data, and so on. All that process data, that's good data that helps us to be used on a regular ongoing basis. So at the very beginning of the webinar, when you guys were entering the room, we had a poll up, and I can't see the results right now, so if there would be a way that we can slide that over into the presenter in the presentation view. I think before the poll got closed down, we can take a look and see that I'm really pleased by that fidelity data number, but you can see we have a plethora of student outcome data, a good number of that. We also have process and effort data being collected, and I am really pleased by that fidelity data as well to see that up. And if folks put in other, I would love to see what they collected there as well. All right, so I'm getting some questions on my different terms that I use for data, so I'm going to stop there for a minute and make sure that I'm clear on that. So reach data, I was thinking simply as the number of teachers trained or the number of schools who are currently implementing the practice, whether they are in an exploration or all the way to full implementation. Where are they in their stage of implementation, if it's being looked at a school level, for example, was reach. In terms of, I think there was one more question, and I can't see it now. Attendance rates would be another type of process effort data as well. Let me scroll up here to see. For dosage, there was a question about dosage. When we think about the 3 C's of fidelity and those 3 big buckets that NERN talks about, content, context, and competence, dosage would fall into context. So how often is the student, for example, receiving the intervention program that's meant to be implemented at least 4 times a week for 30 minutes? Is the student receiving that dosage, or are they getting only 3 times a week for 20 minutes due to losing transition time, for example? All right, thank you for, you can move that poll on back over. I'm glad to see the numbers go up, but you can see that it gives us a visual of where folks are collecting data and how they're using it. Now let's go into using the data. So it's one thing to collect it. Let's talk about collection real quick, some best practices there. Of course, we want data to be reliable and valid, so we need to use standardized data protocols, have well-trained gatherers. It needs to be actionable and relevant. There's nothing worse than collecting data for the sake of collecting data and it not being actionable. We want it to be available across units, and we also want it to be integrated into daily routines, because we don't want to have data stacked up on our desks that never get looked at and used. And then we want it to be frequently and timely. So for example, frequently and timely, when SysUp administers our capacity assessments, measuring how well the implementation supports are being used, those drivers, for example, we have the protocol that the results are immediately shared at the end of the assessment to engage the team in action planning, and then the reports have to be shared within 5 business days of the administration. As one example, we need to ensure that if we are collecting, that they are being analyzed and reported frequently and timely. I also think of the example of walkthrough data that's being collected in buildings, or observational data, and where a whole quarter, I've seen in some cases, hopefully it's not happening in any of your schools, where a whole quarter or a semester will go by, that data gets collected, and then a team doesn't look at it, analyze it, use it, or it doesn't get shared back with the classroom teacher that was being observed that day, as an example there. So data use. So now we've talked about what data, the best practices around data process, and then what about how we should use data. Data should be ultimately used for decision making. So for example, we want to be analyzing that fidelity data to improve our implementation support, how we're selecting our staff, how we're training, how we're coaching, how are the supports being used to support the practice and our practitioners. Student outcome data is using that, for example, to determine the impact that the innovation is having. We may also, capacity data. So that's, for example, we assess the infrastructures, the drivers, and the other use of the implementation framework, using that to enhance those implementation supports, the leadership, the organizational, and the competency. And then scale up data or reach data used to create, for example, differentiated plans for schools based on their current stage of implementation for a specific innovation or initiative. In my former district, with one district I worked with had over 100 elementaries, another one only had 10. I can tell you in the 100 elementary school district, as well as the 10 elementary school district, I had district schools within different places. Within those schools, their teaching communities, learning communities were also in different places. So how do we differentiate our supports for them based on where they are at? In addition to being used for decision making, we need the data to be widely shared with staff, as well as shared with key stakeholders moving forward. So if we look, for example, if I'm going to go back to our driver slide, we have selection data that's being collected. For example, how folks are receptive to feedback, their knowledge of their skill assessments that's happening during implementation-informed selection practices. That data should be used to inform decisions. It should then it should be used not only to improve selection practices, but to feed forward and inform training. So if we have recruited or hired new groups of teachers based on the selection data, how do we need to differentiate and inform our training practices, training effectiveness data, those pre-post assessments of knowledge, skill assessments, as well as event evaluations as well. How does that data come back and inform the effectiveness of training, as well as feed backwards to selection? And then how does it feed forward to the coaching supports that are being provided? So how do we use selection and training data to inform our coaching plans? And how well do we use coaching effectiveness data to inform back on our training and our selection practices as well as our coaching? Our fidelity data goes into our decision support data system. It informs our selection, training, and coaching practices, as well as what are those facilitative administration or system intervention supports, how well are those working, how are we making this work easier for our staff when they're learning new practices and we're putting new ways of work into place. So data should be feeding forward, feeding backward, and feeding onto itself, all through the implementation drivers here. So if we think about an example evaluation plan for MTSS, these are some constructs and some different measures that we may want to use, for example, that's been put together. We're currently working with the district on this plan. So for outcome data, they have the short-term and long-term data that includes lots of different assessment data. There's state assessments, benchmarks, universal screening, progress monitoring, discipline data. For the fidelity, the use of MTSS, they're looking at the school-wide assessment of MTSS, but it's only done once a year. So is that frequent enough data to inform how well the implementation supports are working for MTSS? So we also recommended our observational tool for instructional supports and systems. It's a 10-minute walkthrough observation of instructional practices based on John Hattie's work. They're looking at using that 6 times a year. We also want to assess their use of evidence-based implementation processes, so putting those implementation drivers and active implementation frameworks into use. We do that at the building level through the building drivers best practices and the district capacity assessment at the district level. You can find lots of good information on these different assessments on the website I shared at the beginning that I'm going to go ahead and share at the end, as well as provide some contact information if you have further questions on them. Unfortunately, I don't have time today to go to a deep dive on each of those different assessments there. And then finally, if we're looking at scaling, for example, at which stage of implementation each school is at for MTSS, we could use the stages of implementation analysis, or Saldana and Chamberlain also have a stage tool that can be used as well. So this is just one example of an evaluation plan being informed by implementation science. So in summary, what type of data should be collected? We want to look at the readiness and the ability of participants to engage in the practice. That's often an outcome of our exploration stage activities. The use of evidence-based implementation processes, so that's the outcome of using the implementation drivers and the other frameworks as well. We measure that here at CISIP and NERN through our capacity assessments. Fidelity of use of an innovation for each practitioner. Implementation climate, an outcome of the active implementation frameworks, looking at that enabling context. And it's also important to assess how well defined and operationalized that innovation is in typical settings. All right, so these are just, there's so many lessons that can be learned here, but here are some ones that I learned from my work in districts and with them and at state level. You gotta have data calendars, and my good friend Ellen has taught me this, drilled it into my head. They're essential for identifying who, what, when, where for each level of the unit, whether that's at the school level, classroom level, district level, at the state level. You got to get data flowing ASAP or information flowing within your implementation. Don't wait. For example, in the exploration stage, we can use outcome data to determine need, as well as use implementation data to determine fit, capacity, or level of resources, the readiness for replication. That's examples of how data can be used in exploration. And my good friend Eric in the State Department is teaching me that you got to get fidelity data flowing within 6 months of the work in order to inform back on how well those implementation supports are working or not working before we jump to measuring outcomes. All right, so I've given you a lot of information so far. I have a little bit more to share in the next 15 minutes or so, and then I'm going to leave us time for questions at the end. But I had these questions posed to me a few weeks ago when I was out working with the state, and they said, what if we're lacking a well-defined operationalized innovation? We're not quite clear on what those essential components are. We know the essential components are those active ingredients, they're just not clearly defined. And what if we're lacking a fidelity assessment? And hopefully I'm not having you all have this reaction and you're putting your head down on the table there. I try to throw in some humor for you. But hang on, that's what our purpose. We can answer these questions through the use of our improvement cycles framework. And let's talk about that one a little bit more, because improvement cycles helps us get started and get better and inform our work in an ongoing way. So improvement cycles is changing on purpose, support the new way of work. They're very much based on Deming's work of the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, and those 5 steps of coming up with a plan of what we intend to do, doing it, studying what happened, and then identifying what can be changed or improved upon, and then cycling again. Some of you submitted questions asking, how is implementation science similar to improvement science, or are they the same? They are similar. Implementation science is similar to improvement science in that we both want to improve outcomes, and we both heavily rely on the use of the PDSA cycles, the Plan, Do, Study, Act. Implementation science goes above and beyond to also, through our other active implementation frameworks, define and want to approve upon who is doing the work of implementation to ensure that there's critical activities in place, defining when that work needs to be done, during what stage of implementation, and what are those critical activities needed to put the practice into use, those implementation drivers, and then finally, clearly defining what is it that we're trying to improve upon through our usable intervention, our innovation criteria. Improvement cycles is really interesting. Our team is absolutely loving a meta-analysis by Taylor and colleagues that came out last spring. Taylor and his colleagues did a systematic review of the application of Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles to improve quality health care. And in their systematic review, they found that only 2 of the 73 PDSA articles reviewed actually engaged in all 5 of those steps. 3%. So we have a lot of improvement to do with our use of improvement cycles as we go forward. And that was Taylor and colleagues, 2014. So why do we use improvement cycles? Intentional and purposeful use of all 5 steps. It helps us, 1, discover and develop those essential components of the innovation when it's not as clearly defined as we need it to be. It helps us develop those competency drivers. So how do we improve upon our selection or develop our training and coaching and performance assessment practices? And it helps us initiate the organizational change that is needed moving forward in order to create that enabling context. Improvement cycles require having the discipline to have a plan and stick to it. We can do way better than that 3% that was found of engaging in all 5 steps. It does require studying and acting, so we don't get stuck planning and doing. I often find the simple strategy of not allowing the calendar to drive us, but instead of us driving the calendar and specifically scheduling in that time for that studying and acting, and working with different teams. They just want to keep going, and getting them to build that time into their schedule for that piece is essential. And then we've got to repeat until that goal is reached. Its cycle is at the end of plan, do, study, and act cycle. So we need to keep going until we solve the problem. Caryn, who's on the line, I've got her quoted there with, as she often says, we're often thwarted but never stymied. All right. SysEp and NERM talks about three improvement cycles in our work. We use 3 of them. They differ by how short or long-term or medium-term the cycle is, how quick or rapid it is, as well as the number of people that are involved. So we have rapid cycle problem solving, which is really the purpose is to use to initially identifying problems and solutions. They're very quick, they're short-term, and they usually involve just a few folks. Say an implementation team, for example, of 3 to 4 folks. Usability testing is a little bit longer of a cycle, tends to be a little bit more involved to it, more people, and we use that to test the feasibility of different solutions and really developing our implementation supports there for them. And then finally, we have our longest and largest cycle, which is the practice policy communication cycle, which involves layers of people. So think from a state to a region to a district to a school building to a classroom, and it's about executive leadership and authorities working to change the system. So that practice is enabling policy, policy is enabling practice, and practice is informing policy. All right, in the little bit of time I've got left, I want to talk with you about usability testing. I have absolutely fallen in love with usability testing since finding my way into implementation science, and I use it all the time. I wish I had this when I was a district administrator, when I look back and reflect on some of the practices that I engaged in. So let's go a little bit deeper on this, because I'm telling you, if you take anything away from this webinar today, I would take usability testing away. Usability testing is a planned series of PDSA cycles to test out an innovation, the components of it, as well as those implementation processes. You make use of them to refine and improve upon, and it helps us proactively test out the feasibility and what the impact is for that new way of work that we're rolling out. So if we're rolling out a new literacy program or a new fidelity assessment, for example, we are doing intentional series of improvement cycles with small groups before going to scale. So this often happens during the initial implementation of a process or procedure. So let's walk through an example from start to finish. So we're going to use the PDSA cycle with small groups of 4 to 5 typical users as one example. Our plan is to use our observational tool for instructional support and assessment. We're going to engage in training and conduct live co-observations. We're going to debrief as a team and study the successes, the challenges, and the improvements needed on using the tool as well as informing the tool itself. And then we're going to apply the changes that we identify to the next set of users, and we're going to repeat that cycle until our goal is reached. We engage in the cycle typically 3 to 4 times before we reach our goal of working out 80% or more of the bugs or the kinks, and not only the innovation itself, but also the implementation support being provided. Some prerequisites is that you got to know, one, what it is you're going to be usability testing on. We got to define it. We got to prepare people. There's got to be a clear teaming structure, and you got to have the capacity to be able to collect and report the data so that we have information to study when we're engaging in that study step of the improvement cycle. Why would you want to pay attention to usability testing? Well, it's a very efficient way to develop, test, and refine not just the implementation supports, but in innovation's critical components as well. In terms of implementation supports, it lets us look at communication around it, training, coaching, the data processes. And the research has shown clearly that if we engage in this, the end user experience for that new practice or program is improved much more by 4 tests than with a single test with 20 users. So it can work out to 80% or greater of the bugs there. You'll see that I have in red, it is not a pilot. Pilots tend to come with special funding, special resources, and it's a thing that you're testing, and you're going to see if it works or not, and if it works, you're going to scale it, and if it doesn't work, it often gets abandoned. I think that's often why if I think back, we did a lot of pilots, and banged my head on the wall where I had some staff wanting to just sit back and wait it out because they know there's a good chance if it doesn't work, it's going to be abandoned. That pendulum will swing. So usability testing is the opposite of a pilot. It's very planned, purposeful, systematic use of improvement cycles to test the feasibility of an implementation methods as well as the innovation component as well. There's nothing about it that suggests that it could potentially go away as we move forward. Love usability testing. All right, so some other things to consider. We got to choose our targets. We got to choose what we're wanting to collect data on in our usability testing in terms of looking at the different components, those different supports or processes, and ones that we're worried about. So ones that may be logistically difficult, they may be outside our comfort zone, and there may be others that you identify. So let's walk through an example of one that we've been working on here at SysUp. So SysUp has developed this tool, the OTIS, and we're engaging in usability testing right now. One, our goal is to inform the OTIS development in terms of the process of using the tool, the protocol, as well as the items themselves, as well as inform the development of our implementation support. So how do we communicate about the OTIS? How do we share what the purpose of the instrument is? What are the training and the coaching processes look at, as well as the data processes? And the goal is we're working with, for example, partnering one state, and their goal is to be able to scale the use of the OTIS across their different instructional coaches. So we need to first start with a limited number of cases or events. We need to consider, we wanted sample variability in order to detect different challenges, but we needed to keep it small enough to give us some quick returns and make it functional and practical to collect both not only the quantitative data but also some qualitative information. So here is our usability testing plan. We started with a team at the state level, a team of 6. You can see we kind of we went a little larger than 4 to 5, which is okay in some cases. Research would recommend sticking with 4 to 5. Giving you a real-life example here. We then, in cohort 2, are looking at including the regional leads. Then we grow in cohort 3 to selected coaches and region leads, and then we're scaling to all 4, to the 50 within cohort 4. So now this cohort 4 may change based on where we're at by the end of cohort 3 as well, so it's a flexible plan as well. So in creating the plan for each of those cycles there, we need to identify who leads the effort, the scope of the test, so how many observations are we going to conduct. They're 10-minute observations. We wanted to ensure we had a range of classrooms from elementary to high school, as well as different subject areas, as well as instructional practices that were happening for different special content like ELL learners and special education. So we identified criteria for who the observers will be and those sites. And we also set the goals for what we were hoping to achieve in order to determine the need for another cycle or declaring it good enough throughout each one. So we were looking for 85% inter-observer agreement, and we wanted 95% or 100% of the protocol steps followed for the use of the tool. We also measured relevant key outputs that were quickly revealed, reactions and opinions of teachers and principals in communicating the purpose of the tool, looking, for example, the percentage assessments done on schedule. We clearly identified who was responsible for reporting the data and on what schedule. So observers had to enter the data at the time of the observation. There was a debrief component protocol that the debrief had to occur with the teacher observed within 24 hours, and then aggregate reporting of all observations conducted and reviewed with the principal within 5 days. And so we specified who was responsible for summarizing that data, and then the state team was who was responsible for studying the data that we were collecting and deciding on next steps. Key to this process is having a core team that runs throughout every cycle. Caryn Blase taught me this. You want to avoid the telephone game. So as we're working with cohort 2 and our learnings there, we want to come back and inform cohort 1 as well as use that in cohort 3. So we want to be able to go back and forth. In order to do that, you need that core team that's running throughout as well. So that was identified. So what did we find when we engaged in this? Well, we did some really rapid cycle problem solving when we hit upon the communication of the purpose of the tool, the introduction of it, and the orientation of staff to it. So we made some changes to the communication processes and the materials there. We made some changes to the training materials. We identified different videos, emphasis of different training points, reviewed slides. We made some minor adjustments to the observation protocol. It ended up informing the tool itself with revisions to the operational definitions, as well as made some minor tweaks and adjustments to the data collection process. And then there was a huge lesson learned for the team on just scheduling of the observations, which was fantastic as well. So usability testing allows us to get started and get better. It keeps the work moving, so we're not trying to wrap it up all nicely in a neat bow and have it looking pretty and perfect before it rolls out. That's unrealistic. We need to get data flowing sooner rather than later, and using that data intentionally and purposely moving forward to inform how well what we're doing is working. This gets messy for evaluation work. It's not clean, cut, dry, but it is very powerful in informing and helping us identify what's working and what's not working in terms of looking at that implementation data and helping us interpret the outcomes as we move forward. So some additional tools that we have to help you clearly define your practice, such as the hexagon and the practice profiles for usable interventions. These are on that website. I'm going to share that website again in just a second. We have improvement cycle tools that you can use, for example, like a PDSA worksheet, communication protocol. And so for more information, if you want to learn more about who NERN is and what we do, I have our NERN website there, as well as then the SysUp website, which is a subgroup of NERN. And then if you want to learn more about implementation via our online learning platform, we have our active implementation hub, and the link is there as well. And here's what the homepage of that looks like when you come to it. So we have some really nice get started videos, video introductions and quick starts to what is implementation, how can I use this active implementation hub, and what would be a suggested learning plan? Where would you suggest I start to learn more about implementation science? That is all available right there under the Get Started. And then under Get Better, we have our different modules and lessons, as well as our resource library and work groups that we use when we're providing training and coaching supports to different groups. All right, so my goal was to hit for questions at about 2:15, and I came pretty close. I've got 2:16 on my time, and I tried to hit questions as they were coming in as I was going, but I don't think I hit all of them, so I apologize about that. I will try and go through them right now, or as we go through. Teresa, Rolf, I'm going to turn this back over to you as well if there's anything that you want to jump in and ask or help me sort through these questions.
Caryn, thank you. This is a lot of good information, and I think that some folks might be a little overwhelmed at there's so much to do, there's so much to construct. And there was one question very early on about, well, how do you do this in with constrained resources and limited time? Where do you start? What is the most important segment to focus on?
Yeah, you can find your way into implementation science in many different ways with any of those active implementation frameworks. A good place to start, I think, is taking the practice that you're trying to implement and really looking at whether or not do I have it clear. Are the essential components or the active ingredients known, and are they clearly defined? If you can step back and do that, it will really highlight for you then how that information can be used to develop the training and the coaching support and give a sense of how much resources it's going to take in order to have this practice be used as intended and well and have the outcomes that we're looking for.
so many other questions here. I'm just scrolling up.
This is Ralph. Karen, I was just noticing that there's been a lot of interaction in the question box amongst people that have been listening, and some folks are answering each other's questions, which I thought was great.
Fantastic.
I'm very impressed by the extent to which we were able to look at different approaches to implementation science and how different data sources are used. And I think just on that score, it's really expanded our abilities. Several people asked about the sources of information about some of the tools that you mentioned, and like Otis and SAM, and are all of these tools referenced in your websites?
The Otis is not referenced on the website. That tool is still very much in development. We're using usability testing right now. We're also looking for partners with folks who may be interested in using that tool and to partner with us on that. So my contact information is at the end here as well, and so they're welcome to email me, and I can share some more in-depth information on the Otis itself. The SAM, that is a measure developed down at George Batch's group out of University of Florida for MTSS RTI, and that is, if you just Google SAM and MTSS, you will find that as an example for more information there as well.
Teresa, do we have a way of opening questions to participants on the phone or through the video?
No, with all the audio issues, I really advise against it. But Sean Irvin had an interesting question here about the macro versus micro implementation process.
Mm-hmm. So can I have a second to read that question? So far, the examples can... Yeah, that's a great question. Great question, Sean. We use those implementation drivers in the frameworks at all different levels of the system simultaneously. So, for example, and they're the same when you work down, when you think through organization. Hopefully I'm getting at what you're getting here. So when SysUp works, for example, with a state Department of Education on building their capacity to implement an evidence-based practice such as like a K-3 formative assessment, for example, or PIS as another one, we are working at different levels simultaneously. So we work and use the implementation frameworks at the state level, at regional levels, at the district level, at the school building level, and at the classroom level. And the application of them is for the overall system change for the state big picture, as well as down looking at what are the individual supports to the practitioner level. SysUp, and it is on our SysUp website, which is this one, as well as on the NERN website. This is the SysUp website. To guide that work, which I think will get at the question that you're answering, and I didn't include that today, I only had so much time, is we use a cascading logic model to guide that. And that logic model specifies what are the implementation outcomes that are needed at each level, at the macro level, in order to achieve the outcomes that we want at the micro level of the individual staff and for students. And as you work your way up and down the cascade, the independent variables become the dependent variables. So I advise you to go to thescalingup.org, type in cascading logic model as well, or on NERN. You'll find it on our NERN website as well, which is on there, that nern.fpg.unc.edu, and you'll be able to find more information on that. Oh yeah, I'm glad I got at what you were talking about. Woo!
You know, Karen, a lot of these questions, and it's sort of raised the similar questions in my mind, have to do with, well, how is this concept different from this concept or this term that we use in this other field? Yep. So maybe in your free time, maybe you could do a crosswalk of the various terminologies across the fields and say, okay, here's some commonalities and here are where the differences are, because I think that a lot of this is sort of, we're all playing in the same ballpark, but using slightly different terminology. And so,
yeah, Teresa, you hit on a key point there. There are now, I think Dean said, and hopefully I'm quoting him correctly, he'll let me know tomorrow if I'm not. In a recent NERD meeting, we were discussing that there are now 62 different frameworks for implementation science. And so the field is still very much a young field, and there's lots of work to be done on developing that, coming to agreement, developing that common language, and so on. And we often, we do have on our different websites definitions, terminology, resources, glossaries that are available to help folks make that crosswalk. I also, if you love these types of conversations and digging in, I strongly encourage you to check out the globalimplementation.org website. There is a global implementation conference that's put on by that group every other year. It occurred this May in Dublin, Ireland, so it's a global conference. I think for 2017 it will probably be back over on this side of the ocean somewhere, would be my guess. No promises, because it was in DC the last 2 times that it took place. But it is a great place to go for exactly those conversations. There's folks from all different fields represented, from public health to child welfare to education, to all different, and it's just a great opportunity and experience to discuss this, because at the end of the day, implementation is implementation.
and it's so easy to do, right?
Oh yeah, right? It is, what I found, I never forget when I first found my way into it, I was like, oh, this is such common sense, but I don't know why we're not doing it. And then having to really step back when I myself was at a district level.
Caryn, this is Ralph. I'm thinking about K-12 education systems, and you made a good point about when we say that, we're talking about really different sizes and scopes of systems. But within a school system, I can imagine that one of the things you do when you go and consult with people is figure out who are the people that should be involved in this and connecting with each other. So if you think about an average school system size, and I don't know what that is, maybe 20,000, 10,000 students, who are the kinds of people that you try to connect typically?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ralph. We very much try to build those linking implementation teams within a state educational context. So within it, for example, at a district level, we're looking to build a district implementation team. We carefully guide them through a process of identifying what are the core competencies needed for that team based on the functions we're asking them to accomplish. Analyze what current structures that they have in place, what current teams may meet those core competencies or be able to fill those functions required. And if not, then start identifying possible staff to fill those competencies, to fill that role, and then identify what are the facilitative administration supports that will be needed to support folks in engaging on that team. And where are the gaps? So we often find in our district work, for example, that it's a multidisciplinary team. You're going to have executive leadership has to be represented. There's got to be somebody there who can make decisions without having to consult a higher authority by leaving the room. So a connect there often, for example, like an assistant superintendent or a superintendent. Depending on the size of the district, it's going to look a little bit different. If there's a gen ed curriculum director, you want special populations represented. Too often, we forget about our special populations until the implementation is already down the road. So I think of the example of where a new curriculum is adopted, and guess what? Not enough resources and materials got ordered for every teacher, including our special population teachers, as one example. So you want to ensure that you have special populations represented at the table as well, and some of your stakeholders as well there. So we very much intentionally guide a district leadership through that process of identifying who, and that same process is is repeated at the different levels, from the state level to the regional level to the district level. We really think about ratios. So the size makeup of those teams and who's representing is going to be different based on whether it's an extremely large urban district, like one of my former districts with over 100 elementary schools, versus one of the districts I'm currently working with on one of our states that consists of 2 schools, an elementary/middle and a high school. And the superintendent is the elementary principal and there's a high school principal. So the composition of those teams are going to fluctuate and depend a little bit. And so what's the role then, for example, in that very small district? What would be the role of regional and state level support? It's going to look a little different than necessarily that large urban district and the number of teams that district will need.
And I'm sorry to cut you off, but I just want to be mindful of our time. And so, folks, the implementation research synthesis lit review is downloadable down at the bottom of your screen. It is a little bit older, 2005 publication, but I think that there's some more recent reviews and commentaries and literature on the NERN website. And so I invite you to go explore those many resources.
We're working on redoing and then on a new revised version of this, I think.
Great. All right. Well, it is 2:29, and I would like to just invite you before you leave us to fill out a very, very brief survey. Your input is very important to us. This helps us determine what future webinars we roll out to you all, and we really want to hear what we could have done better. If you have any suggestions for future webinars and so on, we'd love to hear them. So thank you so much, Caryn. Thank you, Rolf. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, Caryn.
We hope we'll see you again soon.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.